Welcome to the Virtual Salon, which is part of the Harlem Renaissance Centennial celebration organized by Harlem One Stop and the Harlem Cultural Collaborative in collaboration with Save Harlem Now, which is a not-for-profit advocacy organization dedicated to protecting, preserving, and celebrating Harlem's irreplaceable built heritage. The organization's advocacy also includes preserving other elements that contribute to define Harlem's sense of place and special character. In 2018, Save Harlem Now spearheaded the effort to designate the Central Harlem West 130th to 130th Street Historic District. There is a sense of urgency for us. Historic brownstone blocks, faith-based institutions, and buildings that were sites for some of the most significant cultural and political accomplishments of the 20th century for African Americans are being picked off one by real estate developers who are quickly changing the face of Harlem. We are proud to have been able to save the building where the 1963 March on Washington was planned and other buildings like it in the historic district. We thank today's moderator, Chet Whye, for leading an extraordinary group of activists who worked out of 170 West 130th Street. We thank them for donating their time to share their memories and the planning that went on in this iconic landmark. We also thank our collaborators, Harlem One Stop and the Harlem Cultural Collaborative, for helping mount this project. Last, we thank you, our guests, for joining us today. For more information about Save Harlem Now, visit our website at saveharlemnow.org or Facebook page at Save Harlem Now.
Freedom Now movement, hear me. We are requesting all citizens to move into Washington, to go by plane, by car, bus, any way that you can get there. Walk if necessary. We are pushing for jobs, housing, desegregated schools. This is an urgent request. Please join. Go to Washington.
Negroes want the same things that white citizens possess. All of their rights. They want no reservations. They want complete equality, social, economic, and political. And no force under the sun can stem and block and stop this civil rights revolution which is now underway.
On August 28, 1963, 200,000 Americans came to Washington to demand complete freedom for everyone. This is the story of that day.
Then probably then we could integrate. Yeah! Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on. Well, we are all here, black and white. Yeah! Trying to fight for equal rights. Yeah. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on.
They came from Los Angeles and San Francisco, or about the distance from Moscow to Bombay. They came from Cleveland, from Chicago, or about the distance from Buenos Aires to Rio de Janeiro. They came from Jackson, Mississippi, from Birmingham, Alabama, or about the distance from Johannesburg to Dar es Salaam. By the end of August 1963, in some places of the United States, a Negro could not go to school where he chose, eat where he wished, build his home where it pleased him, or find jobs for which he was qualified. He had been insulted, beaten, jailed, drenched with water, chased by dogs. But he was coming to Washington, he said, to swallow up hatred in love, to overcome violence by peaceful protest. Many people predicted violence. Negro groups trained themselves to overwhelm it. Armed with portable two-way radios, volunteers scattered throughout the march would keep watch. Should violence come then that day, they would call for help. Each man would have a code name. Freedom, equality, justice, jobs.
This is Freedom 2 to Equality 1. This is Freedom 2 to Equality 1.
The Constitution of the United States guarantees every American the right to protest peaceably. 200,000 Americans then were going to use this right. 350 years ago, the white man came to America, and 350 years ago, the Negro came to America. The one came as master, the other as slave. 100 years ago, Abraham Lincoln declared as President of the United States that all slaves would henceforward be set free. Now, both black and white Americans were preparing to march to say that a century later, the black man still was not completely free. If I am not free, you are not free. If one man on earth is partly enslaved, the world is not completely free. It was every man's duty then to help every other man.
We need 4 people at table 8.
In New York, volunteers worked for 2 days and 2 nights to make lunches for the march. They made 80,000 cheese sandwiches.
We shall overcome.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
Okay, thank you. Get your buttons here from Martha Washington. Get your buttons here on Martha Washington. Do you have it?
The pen said, I march for jobs and freedom. Everyone who marched wore one. The 200,000 people who were to march that day were held together by the strength of that pen.
This morning, Father, we ask if thou would hear the prayers of thy children everywhere. Those who are burdened down because of conditions here in America, and those who are confused about how they should treat their fellow man. Oh God, we ask for those who have hatred in their heart to touch their hearts right now, Father, and somehow fill their hearts with love. And oh God, make this land in which we live be a land of plenty and a land of righteousness. Oh God, may we recognize this land a land of freedom for every race. Oh Father.
In my heart, we do daily. We shall overcome someday.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Testing. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This is an audio test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In the night, few people had arrived. Negro leaders feared that their work had failed. Those who did come waited singing.
We are encouraged. We're not going to fight our white brethren with malice, nor are we going to fight them with any falsified stories, nor are we going to fight them with hatred, but we're going to fight them with love. When they hate us, we're going to absorb their hatred in love. When they speak against us, we're going to speak things of love toward them. We're not going to let their hatred turn us around, but we're going to love them on every side.
Oh, I do believe, oh, we shall overcome someday.
Shake hands with the person beside you.
Reverend, what about that trademark? Do you want to be free? Yeah! Do you want to be free? Yeah!
All right, just pass them back. All right, I'll start on this side. All right, pass them down. You have any questions?
Wake up, girl.
Or anything that's bothering you? Be sure you contact your captains for anything, and they will take it from there. Do not try to do anything on your own, because the minute you do, you will be upsetting the purpose of this march. The whole thing is an orderly, conducted march.
Oh, there's Mary. There's Mary.
we call this section of our program to a halt and ask you to assemble in your respective groups and begin the march for freedom now. Let us begin quietly and orderly to move out, remembering that by your great numbers you have forced a slow, dignified, and stately march. We'll see you at the Lincoln Memorial.
We see you on here. Very, very fine. We're going to wake up Lincoln. Tell him to get up and stop patting his feet.
Let's ready by the water. We shall not remove. We shall not remove.
Very self-satisfied.
I would first like to congratulate all of you on the orderly, dignified manner in which you executed the march from the Washington Memorial. You have already told the world what we are here for and shown them by your courage, determination, and your order that we mean business.
We will now be favored with a solo, Miss Marian Anderson.
We would like to do for you a Negro spiritual, which has been the favorite of many audiences through the United States. At the piano is Mr. Fax. We would like to do for you, he's got the whole world in his hands.
He's got the whole
In his hands he's got the big round world. In his hands he's got the wide world. In his hands he's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the wind and the rain. In his hands he's got the moon and the stars. In his hands he's got the wind and the rain. In his hands he's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the little bits of baby. In his hands he's got the little bits of baby. In his hands he's got the little bits of baby. In his hands he's got the whole world in his hands. He's got you and me, brother. In his hands he's got you and me, sister. In his hands he's got you and me, brother. In his hands he's got the whole world in his hands. Oh, he's got everybody. In his hands he's got everybody. In his hands he's got everybody here. Right in his hands, he's got the whole world in his
I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I think history was written today which will have its effect on coming generations with respect to our democracy, with respect to our ideals, with respect to the great struggle of man toward freedom and human dignity.
There were many who praised this day and said that there had been a new awakening in the conscience of the nation. Others called it a national disgrace. In the wake of this day, more violence was to come, more hatred, but in the long history of man's cruelty to man, this was a day of hope.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chet Whye, Jr. I am the former Chief Commissioner of the Denver Police Review Board. I'm also a political strategist. Some of you may be familiar with my work as the campaign manager of Harlem for Obama. I am honored to be a moderator today for what I'm sure will be a lively discussion about this historic building, 170 West 130th Street, and its important role as the national headquarters for the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, featuring the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. This building was designed by architect and builder William J. Merritt in 1884. The facade was revised in 1928 by Vertner Woodson Hendy, who was the first African-American architect to be licensed in the state of New York. He is one of the few, this is one of the few known remaining works of Hendy. The building, fortunately, will remain as a protected from demolition entity because it is located in a historic district. The building is also listed as an NYC LGBT historic site, principally because of the March on Washington's chief organizer, Bayard Rustin, who was openly gay. We have with us today people who can speak firsthand about what went on in that building, the personalities that commandeered the operation, and the magnitude and gravity of their mission. It was huge. Allow me to introduce our esteemed panelists. Dr. Joyce Ladner. Dr. Joyce Ladner is a civil rights activist, author, and sociologist. Dr. Ladner served as the interim president of Howard University. At the age of 19, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee organizer was brought from Mississippi to New York to raise the funding that enabled activists and many, many Southerners to attend the march. Courtland Cox. Courtland Cox is a Washington, D.C. business consultant who drafted D.C. small minority business legislation. He was appointed by President Bill Clinton to serve as the director of the Minority Business Development Agency at the Department of Commerce. But in 1963, he served as SNCC's representative on the steering committee for the March on Washington. Lynn Kilgore Hendy. Lynn Kilgore Hendy is a former media and TV ratings sales representative, but she is also the daughter of the late great Reverend Thomas Kilgore Jr., Reverend Dr. Thomas Kilgore Jr., that is, who was head of SCLC's New York chapter. The Reverend Dr. Thomas Kilgore Jr. was the pastor of Friendship Baptist Church, which owned the headquarters building and provided staff support for the operation. Ms. Hendy knows intimately the roles her famous father and the Friendship Baptist Church played on planning the March on Washington. And she spent a lot of time as a young girl in that building during the planning. Rachelle Horowitz. Rachelle Horowitz is the former political director of the American Federation of Teachers in Washington, D.C. Raquel Horowitz was the personal assistant to Bayard Rustin, who was the principal organizer of the 1963 march. Raquel helped run the national headquarters and served as its transportation coordinator. It was she who managed the transport of leaders, organizations, and marchers to and from Washington, D.C. So let's get started. We're anxious. Panelists, tell us about your recollection of that special summer of 1963.
Well, I guess I could go first.
Please do.
Yeah. I remember being excited, overwhelmed, and so important, and felt such a tremendous sense of humility, I guess, that I was one of the few people who, on staff, who was organizing this march. I had come from Mississippi, as you indicated earlier. I was a member of SNCC. And one day I got a call from Ruby Doris Robinson, a Smith rather, who's, I used to call her the general of SNCC. She kept the train moving on time. Anyway, she said, Joyce, I want you to be on the, represent SNCC on the staff of the march. And she said that each civil rights organization was asked to send 2 representatives. So you and Courtland Cox here will be the SNCC representatives. And that's how it happened. I mean, I thought it was just fantastic. And it's my first trip to New York City, or to New York, period. And it was a very exciting place. Harlem was a very exciting place for me. I mean, it was.
How old were you?
I was 19. I was going into my senior year of college at Tougaloo College in Mississippi. And I had spent time earlier that summer in Albany, Georgia, working with the SNCC project there. And while we were there, we took refuge, sanctuary in a church, because the police kept arresting SNCC volunteers. And the director of the project, Charles Surratt, said, told the chief of police that none of us, that we would stay in the church until they would guarantee that we would no longer be arrested. So I left there and went to Mississippi briefly for an outdoor concert that Pete Seeger organized. And he brought Bob Dylan, and then there were the SNCC Freedom Singers out in an open field in Greenwood, Mississippi. That was the concert stage, or arena rather.
Was this to raise money for the march?
No, it was just to give the local people and the volunteers a respite from the day-to-day intense work of the movement. 1963 was, I think, was probably the most significant year of the movement, because it was definitely the most dangerous.
Yes.
In an intense day-to-day way. And I'd grown up in Mississippi and was all too familiar with how one took one's life in one's hand just by being in the movement. So it was really nice to go to New York. I thought it was supposed to be, started out as a vacation from the South. That was not uncommon for SNCC, friends of SNCC members in the North often hosted young people to come up and get some R&R. And while there, then I got this call from Ruby Doris, who told me that I should go on up to Harlem and work. And then the first thing I did was, I was told that I was going to stay with my sister and I. She was there as well. She worked at the Friends of SNCC office, raising. Right. Anyway, to wrap this up, they told us that we were going to stay with a young woman named Rachelle Horowitz. And this is how we met Rachelle. So we stayed in the ILGWU condos. It was her first apartment. And there were 4 of us there, my sister, Dory, of course, Rachelle, and then Eleanor Holmes, who later became Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Really, really? The Congresswoman, yes.
She was a Yale law student, and she came to Rochelle's maybe a couple of weeks after we were there, and she also worked on the march. She was, by the way, the last Bayard said that asked for volunteers to stay behind just in case there were critical phone calls,
right,
other things. So she stayed behind. The rest of us left the day before the march on a train to go down to DC, and Eleanor was happy to get a plane ride next day. And she said she'll always remember flying over that large crowd.
So, Rachelle, how do you remember 1963?
Well, I guess in retrospect, 1963 was the highlight of my life. Then it was just a period of tremendous activity and hopes, and then tremendous tragedy, but trying to deal with it. I had been working with Bayard since 1957 when I worked on a committee to support the Montgomery bus boycott.
Right.
And so I was lucky enough to work with him and Norman Hill and Tom Kahn in the pre-planning of the march. That is, they did a memo to Mr. Randolph for the march. We worked downtown. And finally, when we had the big 6 chairman, and we were definitely going to do the march, we moved to Harlem. That was a great day. And it seemed to me that we worked every minute of 1963, especially leading up to the march. And it was a period of immense hope. In the words of John Lewis, I think we all thought we could create a beloved community.
So you wound up going to that building upon the invitation of the Reverend Dr. Kilgore.
Yeah,
Kilgore Jr.
Yeah, I think Reverend Kilgore was Bayard's go-to pastor.
Ah.
So if he needed something, he went to Reverend Kilgore, and Reverend Kilgore gave him the building. And I said earlier that I feel very badly that we didn't film the inside of the building. I don't think any of us had a sense of history. I mean, what had been wonderful, that is, there were 3 floors with immense activity ultimately going on every minute of the day, from volunteers coming in from the streets, mailing out, because we had to use mail, mailing out leaflets and buttons to every civil rights leader who at some point came to that building, not to mention all of us working there. It would have been lovely if we could have seen that again, but I think we were all rightly focused on Washington.
Lynn, what do you remember about your father at that time, and his relationship? There are a lot of people who just adore him. Historically, he's been so important.
Yes, he was an important figure. He was a very good friend to Dr. King.
Yes. A long-time friend.
A long-time friend. He started working with him in the 50s. And
where did he meet him?
Where did my father
Where
live?
did your father meet Dr. King?
He met Dr. King, funny story, at Morehouse. When my father was a student at Morehouse, he often visited the King home. He became friends with the Kings, and he was actually Dr. King's babysitter. So that's how he met him. He met him as a boy. And then as he grew into a man and went into his ministry in Alabama, Daddy kept up with him and kept up with the civil rights struggle, because my father, had been in the civil rights struggle himself since the early 40s in North Carolina.
Yes.
And it was just something that was instilled in him, that, there should be equality and justice for Black folks in America. And my sister and I were raised with that ethic. And in 1963, when I was 16, I had a job downtown, and I worked from 7 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. And then most afternoons I would come up to the House of Friendship, which is what the building was known as. It was the community center for the Friendship Baptist Church.
Yes, yes.
And I came to the House of Friendship, and I know maybe Rachelle, you probably told me something to do. I don't remember that specifically, but I do remember that we helped with mailings. There were other teenagers from the church. We just did whatever we were asked to do.
Weren't you working at that time also? Had a real job besides your volunteer job?
I was working as a counter waitress at Chock Full of Nuts downtown on Park Avenue. And I would come up after my work day. But, you know, I was 16, so I had unlimited energy. And I just remember, as Rachelle said, the buzzing activity in that building was just unbelievable. And as I said to Chet yesterday, my most clear memory of that time was of Bayard Rustin. Yes. And his just boundless energy. He was always on the phone. He was always smoking. And what I remember most about him was his voice. and his diction. I had never heard a Black person talk the way Bayard Rustin did. And it was just mesmerizing to me as a 16-year-old girl. So my sister worked at the SCLC office during the march. She was kind of like the Girl Friday there. That was like her first paying job. So my father had put us both to work on the March on Washington, and we will be eternally grateful to him for that.
Courtland, there were some very important players in that operation. What do you remember about 1960?
Well, I remember, the thing I remember is the energy. And I would say both on the streets of Harlem and also in the building. I was fortunate because I was part of the discussions of the Big Six in terms of what's the strategy, you know, who would be doing what, whether we would be seeing Kennedy before or after the march, whether Kennedy would speak at the March on Washington. There were a number of issues that Bayard had to negotiate. But I must also say that besides Bayard, I was really impressed by A. Philip Randolph. Oh, yes. He was the man who really held the coalition together. He was the one that, I mean, speaking of the diction and ability to speak, Bayard was one thing, but A. Philip Randolph was another. He was really, you know, he looked like he had come from another century in terms of the way he presented things. The other thing, in terms of the energy in the streets in Harlem. I mean, if you walked on 125th Street, you would hear the Isley Brothers singing Twist and Shout when people were trying to get you into the stores. If you went up to 125th Street and 7th Avenue, people were on all the corners on ladders talking about Africa, talking about this issue, talking about that issue. So what I remember about Harlem at that period was the energy both inside the building and outside the building.
Wow. I just want to interject one thing. Courtland is absolutely right. One night, Bayard said, "Come on, children." It was, I don't know, 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. And he marched us all to the Apollo Theater, where we heard Little Stevie Wonder.
Whoa!
I remember that.
What?
I remember that.
Yeah, he was about 14, right? We all marched. It was an incredible time.
I bet the crowd went wild when he did fingertips.
Yeah, right.
I don't remember whether he.
Well, he did fingertips. He
yeah.
also did. He did Bob Dylan's piece, "Blowing in the Wind."
Blowing in the Wind,
that
yes.
That was, you know, so.
Astounding version of that.
Bob Dylan was also a part of our summer.
So this was an enormous operation. You know, the fundraising, the organizing, the contacting of people, the collection of the buses and commandeering that. Tell us about that, because this was a totally different time you got all those people down to Washington. Not only did you get them down there, you got them down there safely and got them back. So how was that operation? How did you do it? I mean, in this age, you know, did you use your Twitter machine? Did you use Google? Did you have a Facebook event? Well, I mean, what happened?
Well, I think people need to understand is this was done in 90 days. Yeah. So, I mean, while there was pre-planning and stuff forth, the actual organization, and as Rachelle mentioned, I mean, it was pen and paper and mimeograph machine. It wasn't, so I mean, I just think that there are a couple of things that were very much in our favor. The first, and I think Joyce talked about it a bit, is that the Black community was in motion. You've got it, whether you're talking about in Birmingham or in Mississippi or in Southwest Georgia or so forth, they were in motion. The second thing is that the labor movement, particularly with Walter Reuther, was, you know, fairly well organized and very strong in terms of this. And you had a liberal community that was fairly open to, because things had just been beginning to open up. So while the organization was particularly important, what made it possible was that the three groups that composed the people who came to the march were in motion. So therefore it was not, you didn't have to go convince them that they needed to come. They were ready to come, and what they needed was a vehicle that would get them there.
So I would like to add just one more group to that, which was the Black churches.
Yes.
That were really instrumental in getting people there and organizing people and getting buses together. I mean, I think every church in Harlem that I know of sent at least 2 buses to the march. And that was happening all over the country. So the church community was very influential as well.
Yeah.
I just wanted to agree with Courtland and with Lynn. The building was an organizational hub. It is because every major civil rights organization participated. The Black Church, the National Council of Churches, Catholic groups, women's groups. And I think part of what made that building such a hub was the energy on the streets of Harlem, the impetus of people who wanted a march. And we had something that I think may substitute for cell phones and Twitter and Instagram. We had organizations raring to go.
There you go.
Who could absolutely, that is, once they made a decision, they could communicate with their membership. So the Black pastors went out and got the churches done. So the reason we did it in 90 days without all this newfangled technology was human beings and very serious organizations.
Yeah, I wanted to say that we who were in the building were simply the kind of nexus or command center in a way.
Yeah.
And the underground organizing was done by churches, by as Rachelle said, organizations, by clubs, you know, fraternities and sororities. And I always remember that Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier organized the actors and actresses. They flew in from Los Angeles. Others came down from New York. I'll always remember seeing Josephine Baker, who had come from Paris. I'd read about this exotic woman, and there she was on the stage. Paul Newman and Joanne Woodard. Charlton Heston, who became the NRA spokesman, was actually the leader of the delegation.
Yeah.
Okay. So, you know, it was really exciting, and everyone I saw there seemed to be excited and happy to be there. There was no anger. It was a mood of contentment, and within the context of we're on the move. the energy in Harlem was such that I remember seeing Malcolm X on Saturday morning out on 125th Street up on the scaffold, preaching or speaking. And I was mesmerized. I mean, I had heard about this man. He was not yet the person he became in death. Of course, that's true for most leaders, or a lot of leaders. But I remember standing there watching him. Then when we got down to the march, Malcolm was there as well. I remember that after the march, he held forth in the Statler Hilton Hotel. He called it the farce on Washington, and he was surrounded like 5 deep, mostly by reporters. But then some of us stood there, and we too were mesmerized. As I said, he called it the farce on Washington, and not the March on Washington. But someone asked him, "Why did you come?" I think he said he wouldn't have missed it. I forgot exactly what he said, but the gist of it was that, why would I miss this? You know, I want to see all you Negroes down there. He said, you're protesting between 2 dead white men. Lincoln, you're bowing down to Lincoln on one hand, and George Washington at Washington Monument on the other. That was something.
I think if it's to sum it up, and I think we need to use to answer your question, use the statement that King used often. There's nothing so powerful in its idea whose time has come. And I think that was the reason the march was successful. The time had come for what we wanted to say.
Right. That was important because I think of another incident to demonstrate that. One day, I got the mail that was directed to us in fundraising. I got a letter from a woman who identified herself as a Southerner who'd lived in New York for a long time, and it had a Fifth Avenue address. And she said that she was too old and she couldn't go to the march, but she wanted to support those people that I was raising money for. And she sent a $500 check. Tom Johnson of the New York Times, later of the New York Times, I don't think he was working for Newsday, a Black reporter.
Right.
Asked, stopped by the office often to try to get tidbits of news, something he could write about. And he was there when I was writing this woman back, and he asked me, well, what are you going to say to her? I remember writing back that you're not too old to march, come on and join us or something. And of course, thanking her for the money, because she said specifically she wanted to support Black people in the South who to get up there. And Tom Johnson wrote a piece about it in Newsday. He called her and talked to her. I mean, so the time has come. You know, it aroused. In some ways, it reminds me of response after George Floyd was murdered. You know.
There we go. There we go. What kind of I mean, observing, especially this year and everything that's going on, how would you compare this period that we're in right now to what was going on in '63 and the '60s in general? What are the similarities? What are the differences?
I was more hopeful back then than I am now. Much more optimism.
I think.
Why? Courtland?
No, I think that what was done in the '60s was very helpful in allowing a number of people today to do what they're able to do. What was done in the '40s and the '30s helped us do a number of things. I think that, you know, I think the Black community and particularly is a lot smarter in terms of their understanding of the society and what we have. I think we're facing an unprecedented challenge not only to the Black community, but to America in general. But I mean, and I think, but I also think that what people can learn from what was happening in 1963 was something that Whye had always talked about. I didn't always agree with him, but I think on this issue, I think that's important, what we see today. His point is that in order to achieve what you want to achieve, you have to build coalitions.
Yes.
You have to begin to bring in, you know, a number of other people, because at the end of the day, the question of the majority, what is the majority? Who is the majority? Who will define and who will decide? And I think that's what we're facing right now. You know, will the majority of people, and that's going to be a coalition, whether you're talking about the churches, whether you're talking about the gay community, whether you're talking about, you know, the Jewish community, whether you're talking about the Black community, whether you're talking about young people, whether you're talking about people like Naomi Osaka, who was, I mean, I'm so proud of this young lady.
Yes, yes.
I mean, my sense is that building that coalition and moving that coalition in a direction is what we have to do. I think what young people can learn today is that you're going to need the coalition, the kind of coalition we had in '63, in order to achieve what we want to achieve today.
There you go. And those coalitions are usually of the moment that you have to move on connecting.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things in watching Bayard over the years, studying him, this whole ethos about coalition and being uncomfortable. You have to be uncomfortable, because it says that if you are comfortable with everyone you're with, your coalition isn't big enough. So you have to extend yourself into these zones that you are not really comfortable in, but you have to make that connection in order to get what you want. And I looking at 63, and we talk about people who were the movers and shakers, and we talk about the people who joined in. You know, some of those personalities, and we mentioned Charlton Heston,
yeah.
But some of those personalities, you know, may not have ultimately been wound up in the same place or stayed in the same place, but at the time, they were right there, and they jumped in, and they helped make things move. I mean, everyone, as far as your observation of some of the players, you know, and mention some of the women who were involved, as far as, you know, what about Anna Arnold Hedgeman? You know,
she was around.
What was her role?
There was I just wanted to say that there was a huge fight apparently in the entertainment caucus between, you won't be surprised, Marlon Brando and Charlton Heston. Heston, the right wing, so to speak. I just wanted to say one thing, and then I'll talk about a little bit about the women. People today, Black Lives Matter, have a much more difficult problem. We were dealing with juridical segregation. We were fighting to win legislation and to end segregation and discrimination. We are now dealing with systemic racism. That's a much more difficult problem. And Courtland is absolutely right about coalitions and being uncomfortable, but it is a new ground for civil rights movement. I mean, in the past, it was this bill, anti-lynching, integrate the army, let's pass housing, let's end housing segregation. And now the good news is we're dealing with systematic racism, and the hard news is we're dealing with systematic racism.
And could I just say that one difference that I see between then and now is that each of the components of the larger coalition, each component had really strong leadership. And I don't see that now. We have coalitions that we have to put together. We have to put together women. We have to put together gays. We have to put together churches. But each piece of that right now does not have the kind of leadership I don't think, that it had in 1963. And so that, I think, is one of the things that's a problem for us.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I really don't know why that is.
Right.
You know, I mean, you can go back to the whole thing about leaders are born, not made, and maybe they just aren't any born now. I don't know. But that's one of the things that I observe from the predicament that we're in now.
I think one of the differences is that we accepted a lot more of the great men of history, like Dr. King as the leader, you know, as Ralph Abernathy as a leader. Nowadays, with the society having expanded the population exponentially, I mean, it's hard to find a single person, you know, who emerges as the unquestionable national leader. We see Reverend Barber on TV a lot, but you know, who follows him? That's the question. I think leadership is now a lot more decentralized. I think it's a lot more grassroots in many ways, back to the communities. That's one of the differences, but I do agree with you that there's a dearth of recognizable leaders who can command big following. I think we began to see the decline of that after King was murdered.
What about the impact of the presidency? Those dynamics. I mean, right now we've got Agent Orange, and back then you had John Kennedy, and the balance of, you know, where Kennedy was going and where the march, what it needed to go to, where it needed to go, and how you had to navigate John Kennedy to get this done, and to get this done in a way that it went with the emphasis on the march and the marchers and what that was about, as opposed to the administration.
Yeah, let me say a couple of things. I'm going to answer your question in a second. What is also phenomenal to me, that when I look back on it, is how young everybody was.
Right.
I mean, most of the people were 35 and under. I mean, I'm talking about Belafonte. I'm talking about Martin King. I'm talking about people, I mean, they were 35 years old and younger. Now, I want to just talk a bit about today. Rachelle talked a bit about systemic racism, and in terms of what people are facing, and what was made that really laid bare was COVID-19.
Right.
Where we looked at what's called the underlying conditions, and the underlying conditions were all systemic racism. Whether you were talking about food, whether you're talking about health, I mean, whether you're talking about who were the essential workers, or all those kinds of things. And I think that the thing about, as you call Agent Orange, I'm assuming you referring to the same person. There is the thing about it, it's clarifying, but it's also frightening. It's very easy to see, but it's also very frightening. And I deal with a lot of young people today, you know, and it's interesting because they want to do something, but they're trying to figure out, how do we move beyond what Rachelle talked about? You know, the question of, you know, legal segregation and the laws you're having to deal with, and systemic racism. I talked to a young lady last week or week before, and this was when we had the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington with Sharpton. And she said, you know, I think what people are talking about is what, you know, what's being visible is looking at what was in the 1960s, but I think we're closer to what's happening and what happened in the 1930s. I mean, and she was like a real young person who belonged to the BYP 100, you know, and she was trying to figure out how do you now begin to understand systemic racism? And I'm wanting to know from me, how do we begin to deal with that? They're trying to think it through. So I have a lot of hope in these young people, because they beginning to understand that they're dealing with a different kind of problem, and how do you go about thinking about dealing with it?
I think to piggyback on that, the problems that young people are trying to solve or have an impact on today are infinitely more complex than those problems we dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, everything was very clear, and there were clear choices. Either black and whites. There was a sense that there was right and wrong. You know, in SNCC, so much of many of our rituals and our beliefs and strategies were born, you know, in the Baptist church in the South. Old Testament prophets were looked to because they talked about such things as justice shall roll down like a mighty stream. And we were specifically looking to change two things in the beginning. One is to desegregate public facilities.
Mm-hmm.
A law was passed in 1965 that made it, it was against the law to discriminate against others in public facilities. And we wanted the right to vote. So in 1966, the Voting Rights Act was passed. And with that, we also saw that when we went to New York to work on the march, the movement was very much a Southern thing. It was remote. It was, for most people, they saw a little written about it in some things written about it in the newspapers, but it was not yet a Northern problem, or not viewed as a Northern problem. I think the march changed that. March nationalized the civil rights movement and nationalized the idea that there are Americans who are being discriminated against, and that all of us should be involved in trying to solve some of these problems. So we saw a lot more Northern volunteers going south to work in the movement. We in SNCC extended our campus travelers, and those were SNCC members who would go around to organize different Friends of SNCC groups in towns as well as on campuses. And we saw some of the young people who later were active in the anti-war movement come into SNCC, you know, from Berkeley and Stanford and other places. But very little of that happened before the march.
Let me step in just a bit to the audience. If you have any question that you would like the panelists to address, please go to the chat at the bottom of your window and input your question, and we will funnel the questions to the panelists. All right, but and talking about Harlem itself, did the headquarters being positioned in Harlem and in New York City facilitate this fire in Northerners to get involved directly in the march and into the civil rights movement that was already, you know, red hot in the South? Did the position of the headquarters in New York City, Harlem, matter to that?
I'm not sure how to answer that, but I can tell you it could not have been organized anywhere in the United States but New York.
Right.
I mean, the march on, because
everybody's here.
Anybody, I mean, who could do it they lived in New York, and so New York was essential to making it happen. Now, I'm not sure about the other issues, but it clearly was essential to making it happen.
I think it had to be Harlem, and everybody knew Harlem was the capital of Black America.
Right.
There you go.
And it's where all the intellectual and vitality and debate. I mean, A. Philip Randolph had started his life standing in the street, debating in Harlem.
Right.
And Malcolm X continued, not in the ideological tradition, but in the tradition. So I don't think there was any question that it had to be out of Harlem.
I agree with that. And
Well,
it certainly
the intellectual
mobilized the
energy.
Harlem community.
Also, it was a safe space to organize.
Yes.
And in Atlanta or New Orleans, and certainly in Jackson, Mississippi, where there are active movements, the police would have come in and broken it up, you know, put a padlock on the door of the building and so on. So it was a safe space. It was an encouraging space. And I think about the local people like Cleveland, what was his last name?
No,
Robinson.
Cleveland Robinson.
Steve Robinson. And others who were, you know, brought their resources to bear on that building and what we were trying to do. I remember that some of us went out one day in District 66? 65. Was having a big civil rights event. And I remember I went and another SNCC member, Curtis Hayes, went, and we were all sort of marching. I don't know if we got outside the building or not, but I had a picture of that one time. But it was the tremendous support, infrastructure support, and volunteer support, and the money, you know, that was raised out of New York.
And I think one thing that, you know, people were really surprised that so much was happening in that building, because if I remember correctly, it was very sparsely furnished. I mean, there was just nothing there. You know, like a couple of desks and chairs. And
I bet you had plenty of phones, though.
They had phones, yeah, but
yeah,
there was it certainly was not luxury.
Right.
And I think people were surprised that so much good work came out of such a humble space.
Exactly.
I just wanted to tell you a story about, it was the streets of Harlem too. There was a man, his name was Howard Bennett, and he was an older man, and he had been a World War II, I think, veteran, and was on a disability. And whenever I asked Bayard what Benny did, Bayard would say he works the streets of Harlem. It'd never be quite clear. But every day, Benny came up and brought lunch for people. I mean, he brought me greens and ribs every day. and then Benny also organized buses on the streets, not church buses, his own buses. And I got indignant because he was charging $1 more per passenger. And Bayard said to me, now, the man's gotta live, you know?
I think he still lives in the neighborhood.
I'm sure he does. I'm sure Benny's still alive. But that was what you also had in Harlem. You had the Bennies, and you had the establishment types.
And
some things don't change.
Right.
Well, at this point, you know, we have some questions from the audience, and let me reintroduce my friend Valerie Jo Bradley. She's the author of the Harlem Travel Guide. She's co-founder of the Marcus Garvey Park Alliance, which is where I really started working with her in trying to save and restore the Harlem Fire Watchtower, which is up and beautiful now. And she is the president of Save Harlem Now. Valerie.
Hi. We have a number of very good questions, Chet, and I just want to throw them to you. One person is talking about that it was sad to hear that the panelists felt they were less hopeful now, and she wanted to know why.
Well, I said that I'm less hopeful. I think it's because of the tremendous opposition to equality, or freedom rather, coming from the White House, from the highest levels. I mean, we expected that the Ku Klux Klan back in the South, in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, would certainly take their pot shots with their rifles and shotguns and try to kill people and so on. But the entire national mood, the presence of so many militias, the idea that people can walk the streets with their guns and intimidate people. We didn't see that back then. I mean, I mean, I think it's harder to get things done today. We can't get the votes for an extension of the Voting Rights Act. When the Voting Rights Act was passed, naive as that may have been, I never imagined that we would have to, that would have to be renewed and under such opposition, you know?
Can I just say also about that, and it's just taking off from what Joyce said. John F. Kennedy opposed the March on Washington. His whole administration didn't want it to take place. They did all sorts of legitimate things to get it canceled. That is, they had wrote letters, they lobbied, and when it became inevitable, they compromised and moved, and we negotiated. Right. And Joyce is absolutely right. We have an administration now that is joining and is on the side of the Ku Klux Klan. And I guess I keep on saying I want to be put into a coma until the election is over, because this is such a serious time in our history. And I think it's unprecedented. Even Dwight Eisenhower, as we said, sent troops to Little Rock, and we had a youth march for integrated schools, and Eisenhower would not meet with the delegation. And in those days, that was like our symbol of, isn't this terrible? And now we have, as you say, the orange man, and he is just the mouthpiece for every racist, right-wing, evil element in this.
And well, he is actually empowered all
exactly.
that. You know, he is given an edict that this is okay. This is sanctioned by me.
Exactly.
But I think that, you know, one sliver of hope, and I'm hoping it's more than a sliver, is that, you know, everybody, I think that there are more people who don't like what's going on than like what's going on. And we just have to get together in a coalition, as Courtland says, and vote and get rid of this man and the Republican senators that go along with it.
Exactly.
And if we can do that, then we can start to turn this ship around.
That's right.
I think we're looking at a situation where it used to be that people looked at, and I think even today, Democrats look at Republicans as the political opposition. I think what Trump has done is made anybody who opposes him the enemy. Right. There is a difference between opposition. You're at least part of the community and the group, but now you're the enemy, and any tactic is all right. And what was most dangerous is the attitude these guys had. As I can deal with the stuff for Black people. I mean, we used to that. But the attitude when COVID-19 hit, and it hit the northern states first, their position, well, it's Democrats, so who cares?
Right.
You know, people were dying, and it was Democrats, who cares? I mean, even today, they have a view, and it's not said out loud, but their view is herd immunity. They really do not care that Americans are dying.
They know who's going to die first.
They care that Americans are dying. You know, so, but let me just get back to the point about the way I feel today. One of the most humbling things I realized in my life is that I could have done everything that was necessary, but it wouldn't be sufficient. And so that is very humbling. We did a lot of stuff, but we did what was necessary, but it wasn't sufficient. And so we have to understand as we go on. That's what I tell young people, because what you bring as young people to the discussion is energy, hope, optimism, a sense that if we put our hearts and minds and soul into this, it will make the difference. It will make a difference, but it will not make the difference. And so my sense is once I understood that, now I know that this is a marathon, and that my responsibility, even now I know all the things that I've said would happen could not happen. Now is my responsibility to talk to the next generation.
There you go.
And let them know But I'm also saying to them, you will do all that is necessary, but not sufficient. They don't understand it, but they'll come to understand it when they get to be our age.
I'm finding that they're eager to listen. It's like you know, the song "Glory" with Common and John Legend.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they understand it takes the wisdom of the elders and young people's energy to get some of this done.
Right.
Okay, we have a question about why has it taken so long for Bayard Rustin to be recognized as the genius that he was?
Okay.
Oh, I think the very simple answer to that is that he was gay.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And let me also say to you, Bayard was a genius.
Yes.
Let me tell you, first of all, and it's interesting, because when we were at Howard University, Stokely Carmichael, myself, and others, Bayard was our mentor in terms of dealing with a lot of political stuff that we didn't all understand. You know, Rachelle will know the Trotskyite, Stalinist, and so forth, but we'll deal with that later on. But I am telling you, I'm going to just say one thing. So while Kennedy opposed the march and was opposed to it, at some point he wanted to control it.
Of course.
So therefore he sent word to, and I'm not going to name the person he sent word to, but he wanted to speak at the March on Washington.
Really?
So Bayard said, we cannot have this. So, and you know, Bayard used to walk with a flask in his back pocket. And, you know, we were both going to the bathroom at the time. And Bayard said, you know, we're not going to do this. So when he gets back to the meeting, he says to the group, I understand from the community that if the president comes, the black people will stone him. So, I mean, and everybody got upset. Oh, no. Now, Bayard made that shit up coming back from the bathroom. He knew that they could not. I'm just saying, I mean, on his feet, I mean, he was really, I'm telling you, watching him up close was a joy. And you're absolutely right about why he didn't get his propers.
Yeah.
I mean, because, you know, being gay at that time, when you talk about another genius, James Baldwin, people like that, it was brutal. I mean, you know, you would be arrested on morals charges and all that kind of stuff. You were viewed as a criminal. And I would say, again, the big propers to A. Philip Randolph, who gave Bayard cover. Right. Because if it were not for A. Philip Randolph, Bayard could not function, because there were some long knives. I mean, and some people that we know are big time people, political people, who had long knives out for Bayard. Yep. I mean, people in Harlem, I'm not going to call any names, but people in Harlem had long knives out for Bayard.
Mm-hmm. True that. That is true.
Okay. And go ahead, Rachelle.
Oh, no, Courtland's story about the march and Kennedy just reminded me of a wonderful story about Bayard meeting with the Justice Department people. And when I was coordinating the buses, I had lost, when I marched on Washington, I always lost my bus, and I was dyslexic about direction. So I had said to Bayard that no bus could move. Once they let the people off, they had to say, this is where we'll be. And the Kennedy people in the Justice Department said, no, you have to move the buses away and you can't park on the mall. And Bayard rose up with all of his drama, and he said to them, see here, my transportation director assures me that if you move so much as one bus, there will be riots. And of course, they didn't move a bus. Of course, they didn't tell them that the transportation director was a 25-year-old woman who had no sense of direction. But
you have another story, Rachelle, about him training some people.
Oh yeah, that gets us back to the building. That building, though sparsely furnished, had a courtyard, also sparsely furnished. And Bayard was determined that the only policemen that would be used in the march, the army, would be people we provided, that he wanted the Kennedys at one point offered all sorts of support. He wanted them watching the perimeters of the march, the Nazis and people who were going to disrupt it. And there was I think, Valerie, you told me that he still exists. It's the Guardians. It's a Black fraternal organization in the police department, and there's another one in the fire department. And Bill Johnson, who you will see wearing a white hat standing behind Dr. King when he speaks, was the head of them, and they volunteered to be at the march. I'll try to make this quickly, but this is 57 years ago, and these were Black policemen who volunteered to be monitors of the march, and they understood, and Bayard understood, that they needed training in nonviolence and in nonviolent crowd containment. So every day, at some point in the day, Bayard would take 15 or 20 of whichever volunteers appeared, and they would go back into the courtyard, and he would teach them nonviolent encirclement, that if some problem happened, you link arms and you walk quietly and you push them and you act in a friendly manner. And it is an amazing story because, of course, the march was very peaceful. The Guardians went down and did it. And the second part of that was that in New York City at that point, a policeman had to carry his gun 24 hours a day. And Bayard didn't want any guns in Washington. And so he went with a bunch of people to Mayor Wagner. There's a different political, and Jackie Robinson called Governor Rockefeller, and that statute was removed so that they could come to Washington without guns. It is, of course, interesting to know that 57 years ago, Black policemen and Bayard all understood that they needed training in nonviolence.
Right, right.
That's a great story. There's a question about what is the role of the labor union today in the struggle as compared to in 1963, where it seemed to be so strong?
Well, the unions are so decimated now. And I mean, like, I think it was Courtland that mentioned Walter Reuther and the UAW. I mean, that was a powerful, powerful group of people. And it gave a lot of support to the march from all over the country, from their locals all over the country. Unions don't have that kind of power anymore. They've been decimated over the last 20 years or so. And so I don't know that they can have the kind of role now that they did then.
Well, thanks to Ronald Reagan.
Right.
You know.
Correct.
Right, but it's incumbent upon the next administration, which we have to make democratic, that they restore the unions to what they once were. They were also the power behind the Democratic Party, and
yes.
The loss of them is put us at a real disadvantage.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you have any questions, Chet?
No, I think this is covered. I want the panelists to give a last couple of sentences, you know, as we close out. And we'll start with Dr. Joyce Ladner.
Well, I should clarify to some extent my comment about being very pessimistic. I am indeed pessimistic about what is going on now, but I believe very, very strongly in the power of the people to change their fate. And therefore, and I've never been one to just sit back and say, well, nothing can happen and just do nothing. But all of us are now dealing with our very survival. If we don't make a change now, I think we will definitely see the rise of a Putin-style president, as dumb as he might be. There's nothing worse than having a dumb person dominate you. Anyway, but moving forward, I think that each of us has the power, as Ella Baker used to teach us in SNCC, the power to change things. And that there comes a time in our lives when we either move aggressively to effectuate those changes or we perish. I don't think we have a choice. So I am very optimistic about the power that we possess to make these changes in society. And it's our job now to get that message out, drive people to the polls. I'm elderly, but I'm driving elderly people who are more elderly than I to vote because everyone seems to want to go to the polls to cast their votes, since the post office is such a mess.
Yeah, wonder why.
But young people all over the country now are out there. They've identified what their issues are, and I think each generation does that. We did, and others subsequently. But so while I see the landscape is just god awful horrible, I do believe that it is up to us to change it.
Okay, and going clockwise around my panelist screen, we're going to go to Courtland, and then Rachelle, and then Lynn. Courtland.
Yeah, well, I think there are two things. First of all, there is great clarity in the Black community, particularly around young people. I also think that I see for one, I think for me it's very impressive, is that I see in white affluent neighborhoods, white people standing up on the corners with signs saying Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And I think, for me, it's one thing to go to a demonstration and so forth, but to be in your community making that statement is, to me, a very important thing.
Rachelle.
It is very hard, and I take heart from Joyce to be optimistic. I sometimes feel very sad, also going back to what Courtland said, that this is the world I'm leaving to my grandchildren. I mean, I thought I was going to leave a better world. And I also think some days we're living in a period of floods, pestilence, and fires. Difficult that is. But Joyce and Courtland are right. I mean, the youth is on the move, white youth and Black youth, and they have attitudes that are much more progressive than in my day. And hopefully this November, we will change the course of this country.
Right.
Lynn.
Okay, since I have the last word, I first of all want to pay homage to my father, who gave this building to the March on Washington, and it's really kind of, a foundation for why we're here today. And certainly a foundation for me and my life and my sister's life in giving us the ethic of Black equality and justice. You spoke of your grandchildren, Rachelle. I agree. I have grandchildren too. And I think that it is incumbent on us to give them the skills and the beliefs that were given to us when we were young people, and to try and encourage them to participate and to vote and try to make this world a better place. It is imperative in America that we do this year.
What a wonderful discussion.
Can I say one thing?
Yes.
Some people have asked, how can they get a copy of this session?
Well, this is how we do it, all right? Very soon, I suppose within the next 24 hours, this video will be available on the Harlem One Stop YouTube page, and also on the Harlem One Stop and the Save Harlem Now Facebook pages. So please look for it. And I implore the audience to take this great discussion and share it, put it in your network. We have to have this kind of talk, because how else are we going to get, the kind of a wealth of knowledge about the significance of where we are now, how we got here, what happened before, and how that is a lesson for how we should proceed. I mean, you can't Wikipedia this. You can't. You can try, you know. You can go to Google machine, but you're not going to get this. So I really want to thank all of our panelists today. I want to thank the audience for tuning in. And please, please, gain this video and share it. My name is Chet Whye. Thank you very much.
Okay.